This is 1974's Black Christmas. Warning, spoilers ahead. We open up to a sorority house with all of its Christmas decorations up, and things seem to be peaceful in the neighborhood. Inside is a little different though, but what no one notices is the fact that someone is lurking around outside. Barb comes downstairs to find the front door open, and she promptly shuts it while she reprimands the guests in the other room. The lurker outside spots a window on the second story, and they climb a trellis found on the side of the building. Back inside, Barb tries to find out why she was the only one that went to work that evening, but Phil swears that they were there before she got there. Soon the phone rings, and Jess answers it promptly. She has trouble hearing who it's for, but then she finds out that it's a long-distance call for Barb. You remember long-distance phone calls being a problem? Even weirder, do you remember how cell phones only worked within a certain range before it was considered roaming? Now I ought to be able to call the moon without so much as a surcharge. Barb tells Jess that she'll take the phone call in the other room, and she leaves the room. Meanwhile, the lurker finds their way into the house in what appears to be the attic full of all sorts of trinkets. Barb tries to hush everyone so she can hear her own mother on the phone, but she ends up having to contact the operator. At the same time, Jess tells all of the guys in the house that the party is over, and they all have to go. The lurker makes his way out of the attic, and he creeps onto the stairs to watch Barb talk to her mother. Barb finds out that her Christmas break plans are going to change thanks to her selfish mother, and the rest of the sorority sisters say goodbye to their dates. When Barb makes her way into the other room, she tries to see how many of the others want to spend the Christmas break with her. Suddenly, the phone rings in the other room, and Jess goes to answer. Whoever's on the other end of the phone is a weird one, but what's even weirder is that Jess is used to it and has a nickname for him, the Moaner. If you have a regular moaner that calls you, you need to contact the police or something. All of the girls gather to listen in on the phone call, and they all hear the Moaner making slurping and groaning noises. Ugh. Suddenly, the caller screams and starts saying some really obscenely sexual things to the sisters. Barb hops on the phone, and she tells the Moaner to go bother another sorority. Finally, the Moaner tells her that he's going to kill her, and Barb hangs up on him. Claire is worried about Barb provoking someone like the Moaner, but Barb doesn't seem to care anymore. Suddenly, there's a loud knocking at the door, and they answer to find Mrs. Mack with her hands full of presents. Claire heads upstairs on her own to finish packing, and she finds Mrs. Mack's cat on her bed. When Claire takes her clothes out of the closet, she doesn't notice that the lurker's hiding in it, and now I'm confused on my horror movie rules. I thought being a virgin was a guaranteed way to make sure you make it to the end of the movie. Not this time. He grabs her with the plastic bag, and I have to admit that this 1974 jump scare was better than half of the new ones. While the sisters hang out with Mrs. Mack downstairs, the lurker takes something with him from Claire's room and disappears into the attic again. Jess goes to talk to Mrs. Mack on her own when the phone rings, and Phil goes to answer this time. When she answers, Peter's on the other line, and he asks for Jess. When Jess gets on the phone, she tries to tell him that he needs to find time to talk to her in person, and she agrees to meet with him tomorrow. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mack goes to brush her teeth, and she pulls out a bottle of booze to use as mouthwash. I do not recommend that. Really isn't a pleasant experience. Jess goes to talk to Claire, but Claire never answers her door. We see that her head is wrapped in the plastic in the attic, and we cut to the morning. The church bells ring, and Mr. Harrison is hit in the head by a snowball. When a boy comes over to help him, Harrison asks about his daughter Claire. He tells him that he was supposed to meet her here half an hour ago, but she isn't there yet. The boy tells him how to get to the sorority house, but when he's there, Mrs. Mack tells him that she hasn't seen her. Mrs. Mack asks Mr. Harrison if he'll give her a ride somewhere, and after talking about how disappointed he is in the morals and atmosphere of the house, he agrees. Mrs. Mack goes to get ready, but she gets distracted when she hears her cat elsewhere in the house. Eventually, she goes on her way. And now to give you whiplash with what story you're supposed to be invested in the most, we cut to Jess as she tells Peter that she wants to get rid of her unborn child. Did that throw you off? Good. Peter wants to have a baby with Jess, and he thinks that she's being selfish in her decision. He tells her to get out, but before she leaves, he tells her that he'll be by to talk about her things at 9 o'clock that night. Back at the sorority house, Mr. Harrison calls his wife to reassure her that Claire is probably okay. And Barb gives a grand demonstration of how to interact with children while they do a neighborhood Santa Claus. Later, Jess gets a wrong number call from someone that asks what someone did with a baby. Then, Mr. Harrison goes with Barb and Phil to the police to report Claire missing. But the police don't seem all that involved. Back at the house, Mrs. Mack tells Jess that Claire is still missing, but Jess hasn't seen her either. Jess is the only one that's following any leads at this point. She heads straight over to the hockey rink to talk to Chris, who's the boy she was supposed to meet the night before. Ready to get thrown off again? Let's hop over to watch Peter play piano for a while. You're welcome. Later, Chris and Jess barge into the police station to demand answers about Claire. And they sit with Lieutenant Fuller, who seems to be taking things more seriously than the last officer. That night, Mr. Harrison stays for dinner, but he seems to have no appetite in light of everything going on. At the same time, Barb gives some nice animal trivia. I don't know if this is a fact, but she says that there's a species of turtle that can go at it for 3 days straight without a break. That's impressive. Suddenly, Barb brings up that she thinks everyone thinks Claire's disappearance is her fault for being so crass with her. When Mrs. Mack tries to calm her down, Barb unleashes some more anger, but Phil finally tells her to just go to bed, since she's so drunk. Across campus, Peter decides to smash up the piano. I'm assuming that his audition didn't go too well. Then Chris and Jess show up with the news about Claire, and the whole group heads out except for Mrs. Mack. Mrs. Mack tells Phil that she might not be here when she gets back, but she promises to check Barb before she leaves. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Fuller is organizing a search party for Claire, but back at the sorority house, someone posts up outside the snow while Mrs. Mack drinks and packs up. Eventually, a taxi pulls up for Mrs. Mack, but she hears her cat creeping around the attic. She heads up to investigate, but her search is cut short when she spots Claire's head on the windowsill. When she turns around, she finds the lurker waiting to hook her, and he does just that. The lurker screams after he watches the taxi driver drive away, and he wrecks the attic in the process. How drunk was Barb that she couldn't hear any of this from her bedroom? I'm not judging, some of us have been there, but at some point, you kinda have to wake up. Back at the search party, Jess leaves to go back to the house, but suddenly, someone finds the body of yet another girl that has apparently been missing. The phone rings at the house as Jess comes in, but on the other end comes random calls of help for someone to stop whoever it is. Jess tries to find out more, but all he says is Filthy Billy. Jess hangs up on the caller, and she calls out for Mrs. Mack. Of course, there's no answer, and she decides to make another call while the lurker creeps down the stairs. When Jess turns around, it turns out just to be Peter instead of the lurker, but Jess turns her attention to her call to the police station about the obscene phone calls. Eventually, Peter gets to talk to Jess, and he tries to reassure her about Claire. After that, he tells her that he's leaving the conservatory, and he plans for the two of them to get married. After hearing that, Jess tells him that she can't marry him because she has her own plans for the future, and she doesn't want to marry him anyways. Peter feels as though Jess is doing all of this to make him feel a certain way, and he starts to threaten her about how she handles the future of her and the unborn child. After hearing this, Jess tells him that he might want to leave, and he ends up brushing by Phil, Bill, and Lieutenant Fuller on the way out. Fuller tells Jess that she wants to tap their phones to try and catch the obscene caller, and he requests to see Claire's room while he's there. Once in Claire's room, Fuller starts looking around, and he asks about the last time anyone saw Claire. He gets a list of phone numbers for everyone that lives in the house, and Bill finishes up tapping their phone downstairs. Before Fuller leaves, he points out that he's posted an officer outside, and he and Bill head out for the evening. They've posted a car outside for obscene phone calls? I couldn't even get 911 to answer the phone for something like that anymore. Phil breaks down in front of Jess, and she can't help but feel bad for everyone involved with the disappearance. She finally admits that she's been really exhausted all day, and she heads to bed early. Jess assures her that she'll be just fine, and she stays downstairs to wait for the phone to ring again. Up in the attic, the lurker rocks Claire in the rocking chair while he sings her a lullaby, and Jess sits by the fire by herself. Later, she rushes upstairs after she hears Barb making terrible sounds in her bed, and she finds that Barb needs her inhaler because of an asthma attack. Barb assumes that she just had a nightmare that sent her into a panic, and it was about a man creeping into her room. She doesn't notice the lurker watching from the doorway, though. Within seconds, she's back to sleep, and Jess heads downstairs to listen to some carolers that are making their way around. Barb should not be left alone by any means. That inhaler was less than an arm's length away, and she still couldn't get it. If something were to happen to her, she'd be helpless. Sure enough, the lurker comes for her next. Do you think she makes it? Yeah, that's a hard no. Suddenly, a nervous woman runs up and tells the carolers that they need to leave since someone was murdered in the park nearby. Just then, the phone rings, and Jess goes to answer it. Jess listens to a terrifying call that sounds like a crime scene phone call, and Bill tries to trace the call at the operator station. After the phone call, Fuller calls Jess to let her know that the phone call didn't last long enough for them to get a trace, and he asks about Peter having a potential issue with her. After talking to Fuller, Jess talks to Phil about what happened, and she fills her in on everything she missed. Jess mentions that the mysterious caller said everything Peter told her word for word, but Phil doesn't think that Peter is sick enough to pull all of these phone calls. After a moment, the phone rings again, and Jess slowly answers it. This time it's Peter, and he sobs while he tries to talk to her about the baby. This whole system for tracing calls is absolutely terrible. Bill keeps following a ticking sound around a room that's full of ticking sounds, and he literally gets to it right before the phone call finishes. I would hate that job. My hearing ain't anywhere near good enough for that. Fuller calls Jess to talk about what Peter was talking about, and he feels like Jess is trying to keep information away from him. He asks her if Peter was with her any of the times that these phone calls came through, and she remembers that he was upstairs during the first call. Fuller wants to go to talk to Peter, but he reminds her that she has to keep the phone calls going longer if they're going to get a trace. A little later on, men from the search party come to the sorority house's back door, and they give some creepy and forward advice before moving on. Jess starts to question if every door and window in the house is locked though, and they make their way around the house. Finally, someone checks on Barb though. Probably wasn't a good idea, but they left her alone for far too long. I don't think we'll be seeing Phil again now, at least not in a living state. Jess continues going around the house making sure everything is locked, and she eventually calls out for Phil. She doesn't get an answer, but the phone starts to ring again. Jess goes to answer, and it turns out to be the disgustingly obscene caller from earlier. I'm rooting for Bill this time. Please let him get to it in time. Watching him run through the warehouse is more nerve-wracking than watching the killer. He got it! Plot twist time, the calls are coming from inside the sorority house. After finding this out, Fuller tries to contact the officer outside the house, but we see that he's dead. Fuller calls one of the officers at the station, and he tells him to call Jess to have her calmly walk out the front door. When the phone rings this time, Jess answers, and the officer tells her to calmly put the phone down and walk straight out of the house. What does the officer do? He tells her the exact thing that Fuller told him not to tell her. He tells her that the calls are coming from inside the house. Someone needs to fire him or put him on bathroom cleaning duty. After hearing this, Jess tries to call out to Phil and Barb before leaving, but when she doesn't get any answer, she starts to scream hysterically. Jess grabs a poker from beside the fireplace, and she cautiously makes her way up to Barb's room. The door is barricaded, but she busts it open to find the bodies of both girls on the bed. Then she hears the voice she heard on the phone coming from behind the door, and she slams the door on the lurker before running downstairs. She manages to make it into the basement under the stairs where she locks herself inside, but when things get quiet, she decides to go deeper into the basement. While down there, Jess hears a muffled voice coming from outside, and she gets scared when she sees a shadow crouch down. Suddenly, she realizes the voice is Peter's, but she decides to hide in the shadows. You know, Peter seemed like he had an alibi for a moment, but when he breaks into the basement, all sense of innocence was gone. Not to mention, his alibi was that he was in the house when the first call was made. Well, that won't work now that we know the twist. Eventually, he spots her and he makes his way over to her. At the same time, the police pull up, and they hear a scream from the house. Fuller and the others break into the basement to find Peter dead on Jess's lap. The police turn the house into a crime scene, but they leave Jess alone in the bedroom to deal with the reporters. Almost immediately, the house is empty aside from Jess, and we hear the real lurker laughing from the attic. Then the phone rings inside, and the credits roll. This is back when horror movies were done right. You don't need all the gore and effects. With a good enough story and twist, anyone can be creeped out. Give it a shot. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this one. Comment what you think I should watch next, and I'll see you in the next video.